Today we're going to talk about an intro to renewable energy. I like this cartoon. It puts in perspective the significance of fossil fuels in human history. Fossil fuels weren't always dominating our energy mix, and they won't always necessarily in the future. So renewable energy resources, they make up a relatively small portion of our energy mix today, but they are the fastest growing. As you can see here, our global energy mix has gone through several phases, from biomass energy to coal to one dominated by oil and gas, and many believe that renewable energy is going to be the next energy age that we'll enter into, where renewable energy dominates our energy resource mix. This shows some global electricity forecasts from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a reputable source, showing two different scenarios: more conservative economic transition scenario and a net zero scenario, both of which you see really steep curves of renewable electricity adoption, again dominating our electricity and energy mix going forward. So in this class today, we're first going to talk about what renewable energy is and what role it plays in our energy mix. And then we're going to walk through the renewable energy project development lifecycle. And in that process, you'll learn about the different technical and permitting and regulatory challenges that renewable energy projects need to overcome in order to get built. So we hear the term renewable energy a lot, but what does it actually mean? What do you guys think of when you hear the term renewable? If used sustainably, I like that. Yeah, we'll talk about why it's important to think of depletability in terms of a spectrum. Generally, renewable energy resources are less depletable than their fossil counterparts, but they can be depleted. Limited OPEX class, yeah. Most renewable energy resources, you don't, like we talked about, you don't have to pay the sun to shine or the wind to blow, right? So typically lower fuel costs, but they often do have higher gathering costs, right? Because many times they're more site-specific. So gathering and transmission can be more expensive. Less impact on the environment, yeah. Generally, renewable energy resources score higher on the environmental scorecard than their fossil fuel counterparts, but again, that's not always the case. That's great. So renewable energy resources encompass a wide variety of resources that are actually very diverse and don't necessarily have a ton in common. You can certainly find some similarities, like we talked about. Generally, they have lower environmental impacts. They're not depletable. They have lower fuel and operating costs, but that's not always the case. There are always exceptions to the rule. In general, what we call renewable energy resources that you see up here, they vary significantly when it comes to environmental impacts, their economics, their role in our global energy mix, whether or not they're growing in our energy mix, and what technology they use. In terms of technology used, for example, you've got everything from turbines to generate hydroelectricity, to turbines to generate wind electricity, to the PN junction to generate solar electricity. There are different uses in terms of heat, transportation, and electricity. And even within every energy resource, you've got a lot of variability, right? Like with solar electricity, for example, you've got everything from installing a skylight to take advantage of passive solar resources, to the PN junction, an electrochemical process to generate electricity from solar energy. So typically when we think of renewable energy resources, we think of the resources up here in blue. Their origins largely come from the sun, with two exceptions, geothermal and tides. Geothermal resources come from the Earth's core, and tides are largely driven by the gravitational pull of the moon. Many think of renewable energy resources as non-depletable or inexhaustible, but as we talked about earlier, it's important to think about depletability in terms of a spectrum. Some of these renewable energy resources can be depleted faster than we can use them. So the lighter blue ones, hydro, geothermal, and biomass, are the resources that we would consider semi-depletable. For example, with traditional biomass, if you cut down a tree and use it and burn it to generate heat, you can't use it again, right? And we have a limited biomass stock in the US and in the world. Hydro can also be depleted. Once you take a water resource from up high and spin it through a turbine to generate electricity, that potential energy is gone, and you can't use it again unless you use energy to pump the water back up into the reservoir. Taking a step back, our hydroelectric resources can be depleted as a result of climate change, right, with the aridification of the Southwest and the Colorado River. Geothermal energy, although heat from the Earth's core is not necessarily getting depleted, what is getting depleted is the heat transfer fluid that's bringing that heat from the Earth's core to the surface so that we can use it for electricity. So water turning into steam and bringing that energy up. So that's one of the reasons why we see geothermal reservoirs energy output depleting over time as that steam resource is getting depleted unless you actively replenish it. Then, of course, you've got the fully depletable resources in gray that take tens to hundreds of millions of years to form, and so are considered fully depletable on human timescales. The other energy resource, again, that we can't forget is energy efficiency, because the cleanest and the cheapest kilowatt hour or therm is the one that you don't use in the first place. But we often don't think about energy efficiency as a resource, right? But again, it is, in my opinion, the most valuable. In this course, we talk about three categories of renewable energy resources. The first is energy efficiency, which is a category in its own. Again, the cheapest and cleanest kilowatt hour or therm is the one you don't use in the first place. It's important to think about megawatts as a resource available to us. The second category are the truly renewable energy resources, where use of those renewable energy resources don't deplete its source. So that's the wind, solar, and ocean resources. And then the third category are the semi-renewable energy resources, where if we don't manage use of those resources, we can actually deplete them. So that's hydro, geothermal, and biomass. I believe you guys have seen this diagram before, but it depicts the economically recoverable resources that are available by different energy resources relative to the world's energy usage. So you've got the stock resources on the left that depict the total available resource period. And then you've got the flow resources on the right that depict what's available annually, because as we talked about, these replenish. Big takeaway from a renewable energy standpoint is that there is quite a bit of variability in terms of what's available by energy resource relative to our world energy consumption. Right? So tides, waves, geothermal are smaller than world energy consumption. I think in the US, the geothermal resources that's technically recoverable and available for us to harness is about 8% of our total electricity demand, whereas for the solar resource, that number is 75 times our total electricity demand. So huge variability there. And even though wind looks relatively small compared to solar, wind is more like 8 times our electricity demand. So still lots of potential wind resource available to harness that we haven't yet. There's a good old trusty LCOE chart shows us that there's also a lot of variability in terms of the cost of different renewable resources. Renewable energy makes up some of the cheapest electricity that we can build today, and some of the most expensive if you're talking about C&I or rooftop solar. Renewable energy resources also have a commonality in that they can typically be more intermittent than other resources because of they're dependent on the resource availability. So because of that, the costs that you see for renewable generation in the LCOE chart aren't necessarily reflective of the full costs for integrating those renewable energy resources into the grid. And those costs are kind of depicted, as you guys remember from the grid lecture, by the California ISO duck curve and the ramping needs of that curve. And yet, because grid operators have a variety of different tools available to them to integrate renewable energy resources and balance supply and demand in real time, despite the challenges of those integrations, we have seen states integrate significant amounts of renewable electricity into their grid, upwards of 50% for states like Kansas, South Dakota, and Iowa that have a lot of wind electricity. Renewable energy resources also have a variety of different environmental impacts. They generally score better on the environmental scorecard. You've got the IPCC life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of different electricity generation resources here, where fossil fuels have relatively higher greenhouse gas emissions than their renewable energy counterparts. However, you've got biomass that can have pretty significant greenhouse gas emissions depending on the feedstock used, as well as hydropower that can have significant greenhouse gas emissions due to the flooding of reservoirs. Again, you'll remember this from the environment lecture, but renewable energy resources make up some of the biggest water users, with geothermal, ethanol, and hydropower using the most water of any energy resource in the US. And although clean energy technologies are less greenhouse gas intensive than their fossil fuel counterparts, they also typically use significantly more minerals, which require mining, and that mining process is fairly energy intensive, particularly for batteries, which, although they're not necessarily a renewable energy resource, they're often paired with renewable energy resources to manage their intermittency. But at the end of the day, renewable energy resources are forecasted to make up a significant portion of our ability to solve climate change. All right, so let's look at the role that renewable energy plays in our energy systems today. Renewable energy resources make up a relatively small portion of our energy mix, about 8 to 9% of our energy mix worldwide and in the US respectively, but a much bigger portion of our electricity mix, given that transportation currently doesn't make up a big portion of our electricity mix, and electricity is where the bulk of our renewable energy growth is happening. And we know that the differential between the electricity mix and the energy mix is going to get reduced as we continue to electrify the transportation sector. So globally, traditional biomass is actually the biggest quote-unquote renewable energy resource that we use today, making up almost 7% of global energy consumption. And this is largely because in the developing world, biomass for cook stoves and heating is still used by about a third of the world. But we don't always necessarily consider this a renewable energy resource because it's super dirty, it's bad for health, a huge driver of deaths as well in the developing world. And it's also hard to measure. So you don't always see traditional biomass measured in a lot of the charts that we show. It's shown in this REN 21 chart here. It's included in the other category, which distinguishes it from the modern renewables. But traditional biomass, I don't believe, shows up in our energy charts typically up here. But it is technically the largest renewable energy resource that we use today, and something you'll probably learn more about in the Developing World lecture. So even though renewable energy is still a relatively small portion of our energy mix today, it is the fastest growing. With wind and solar, which is what's driving the growth in other renewables here, making up the fastest electricity or energy resources from a growth standpoint. And that growth is really being driven by those competitive economics of wind and solar. You saw in the Lazard LCOE chart that wind and solar, at least at the utility scale, are the cheapest electricity resources that we can build today. Those Lazard data, that's US specific, but we see that in other countries across the world as well, where wind and solar are the cheapest electricity resources that can be built in those grids and markets. And those economics are a relatively recent phenomenon. where wind and solar, they weren't always necessarily the lowest cost resources, but thanks to the fact that they're fundamentally technologies where innovation can help drive down the costs as well as manufacturing scale. So the result is that we've seen wind and solar costs come down significantly to be the lowest cost electricity resources. And meanwhile, nuclear costs have been going up because of primarily increasing safety regulations in the US, and you see volatility in natural gas pricing as well, driven by the volatility in natural gas prices. Okay, and because of these fundamental economics, that's why we've seen significant private investments focusing on renewable energy resources, wind and solar, and battery energy storage, among others, to the point where investments in clean energy sector are starting to rival global investments in fossil fuels. So pretty significant transition that our world is undergoing today. And zooming in specifically to the US, this shows you global electric capacity additions by year. And you can see, again, we've gone through some different phases, originally focusing on hydro on the grid. Then new electric capacity additions were coal and nuclear. We had a phase where there was a lot of natural gas being built when we thought natural gas was going to be really inexpensive. And now the bulk of electricity generation capacity additions are renewable energy, wind and solar. And then you can see the huge growth in batteries with the blue at the top. The chart I just showed you was capacity additions, and this shows electricity generation. So you can really see those hockey stick type curves for wind and solar. And I think that this chart also helps show that really the bulk of the growth that's happening is wind and solar. It's not in any of the other renewable energy resources like geothermal, biomass, or hydro, which are all staying relatively constant. Does anyone know why there's that kink in the curve for wind? Bizarre weather patterns, exactly. So the wind resource is driven by temperature differentials, right? And so if we have a climate change and rising temperatures and the entire world is more hot, you've got less wind resources. And that's what happened 2 years ago, and why we see that declined. All right, so the growth in renewable energy resources on our grid is also what's driving the push for electrification of everything, right? Because if we can electrify transportation, if we can electrify, switch from natural gas in our homes to electricity, that allows us to take more advantage of those renewable energy resources. And last but not least, I want to remind you all of the importance of energy efficiency resources and the fact that they have and can play a really big role in reducing our energy usage and reducing our carbon intensity as well. We often see those up into the right curves with solar and wind, but we've got up into the right curves with energy efficiency too. We just don't always see them because megawatts aren't always measured. Again, energy efficiency has the potential to significantly reduce energy usage in different sectors, whether you're talking about transportation, and the fact that, we've got all these systems that, and lots of inefficiencies in those systems. A significant portion of the fuel in our vehicles, for example, isn't actually used to move the person in the vehicle. It's meant to move the vehicle itself. Or electricity end uses like transitioning from incandescence to an LED light bulb that can have a 12x payback in a 10-year period, which is a really great investment return if you're an investor. So significant opportunity there, and really it's been energy efficiency that's allowed various countries and regions to decouple GDP growth from energy use. So I think not quite an up and to the right curve, but it gives you a sense of the real impact that energy efficiency measures can have on our economy and carbon intensity. In terms of where renewable energy is headed in the future, You can see in this chart how forecasts of renewable energy growth, in particular solar from the IEA, have always blown past, or actual growth of solar have always blown past the forecast. So it's a good reminder that we should be skeptical of any forecasts we see that show only incremental growth in renewable energy resources like wind and solar. And remember that humans have a bias to consistently underestimate the capacity for a change in the world. Okay, so let's talk about renewable energy project development. So this is a bird's eye view of the three main steps in a renewable energy project development life cycle. You've got the development phase that can take quite a long time. If it's 1 year, you're lucky, but typically it's going to be more like 5 to 10 years. You've got the construction phase, also known as the engineering, procurement, and construction, or EPC, that might take 12 months depending on what type of project it is, wind or solar, or and how big it is. And then you've got operations, which can last, operations and maintenance that can last for 30 or more years. Yeah.
On the development side, with technology changing so fast, would it be possible to plan and permit a top city project?
Some of the innovation that's happening is like software, where you can integrate it into an existing project. We're at the point with technology innovation where we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit of like panel efficiencies and wind energy efficiency. So what we're seeing is pretty incremental in terms of efficiency gains. We'll talk more about that in the solar lecture. I think typically, you would ideally like to wait towards the end of your development process to purchase the equipment so you get the most out of the technology innovation, but developers are just forging ahead regardless. Okay, so site selection. What do you guys think some of the key considerations are in site selection? I just gave you one. Climatic and geographic features, yeah, right. Like where is the wind resource the highest, where is the solar resource the highest, and what is the terrain like, right? Can you build a solar project there? Yeah. Cost. Yeah, what price you can get for your projects. There's a locational marginal price to electricity. And what cost does it to build? Because, there might be a great wind energy resource in the mountains, but can you get wind turbines up there? Regulations, yeah, exactly. Is permitting going to be hard? Are the relative environmental impacts going to be significant? Community opposition, yeah. Whether or not there's grid capacity, yeah. Exactly, you guys are nailing them. All right, so, you obviously want to go where the resource is the highest if possible. With wind energy is much more resource specific than the solar energy resource, where you've got a lot of wind energy in the Midwest and the Great Plains, where you see the purple here. And that is where most of the wind energy project development is concentrated in the US, but there are also great pockets of wind resources like in the Altamont Pass, where you've got, the temperature differential between the Bay and Central California, and the mountains basically like funneling the wind through those passes. With solar, certainly a lot of the early solar development happened in the Southwest where the greatest resource is, but the technology has improved to the point where the solar energy resource is economically viable pretty much everywhere, even in the Northeast, in Maine, and in Washington and Alaska. So much less resource constrained for solar than for wind. As we talked about, you also have to worry about environmental impacts, right? Because environmental impacts probably mean much greater permitting and regulatory hurdles that you have to get through. This shows a map. So NREL estimates the technically recoverable wind resource, and this map shows the exclusions from that, whether you're talking about public lands, water, urban areas, or other sensitive environmental lands, like national parks. The Nature Conservancy has a map called the Site Renewables Right map, where they've mapped out like bird migratory patterns and sage grouse habitat to help developers understand and other decision makers understand where not to develop wind energy resources. This is pretty significant. If you go to NextEra's wind project in the Altamont Pass or in Solano County, they'll talk about how they have biologists on staff to help mitigate the impact of the wind turbines on birds. You also want to go, as we talked about, where grid capacity is available for you to plug into the grid. And you can either do that by identifying existing transmission capacity that's not fully utilized. You could, monitor where utilities and others are making investments in new transmission capacity. Or the third option could be to target where a large power plant, maybe it's old or maybe it's uneconomic, is about to retire, and you could take advantage of that transmission capacity that opens up. And this shows a map of a lot of the retirements that are happening in the US, most of which are coal-fired power plants, as well as some large nuclear power plants, some of which that have gotten saved in the past couple of years. But also you have a lot of older and inefficient natural gas, like combustion turbines, that are also retiring and opening up that transmission capacity. You also want to go where you can get good prices, right? Not a lot of new wind capacity is going into West Texas anymore, right? Because the economics are unfavorable. So you want to make sure that the locational marginal price that you're going to get for your electricity as you feed it into the grid is favorable both today and forecast into the future. And then another big consideration in site selection that impacts who you can sell your power to is whether or not you're in an ISO or RTO region. If you're in an ISO or RTO region, you can just sell into wholesale electricity markets and then enter into a PPA with Stanford or whoever, right, or the utility. But if you're not in an ISO or RTO region, then your only customer is the utility. So you would only really build there if you knew the utility wanted to buy your power. But early on in the renewable energy project development timeline, a lot of renewable energy development was concentrated in these ISOs and RTOs for that reason, because as we talked about in the grid lecture, that allowed competition with vertically integrated utility assets. Whereas outside of those regions, utilities didn't want to see that competition with their assets because it would reduce their revenue to recover their costs. You also want to go where there's growing load, whether because of population growth or new data centers or manufacturing demand that's coming online. Another consideration is whether or not there are favorable renewable energy policies where you're building your project. And a key policy in that respect are renewable portfolio standards, or RPSs, which are state-level targets for how much renewable electricity the state wants to see generated on their grid or supplied on their grid. Several states have RPSs across the US, all the shaded ones on this map, including about 15 states that have a 100% clean or renewable electricity targets. This is a relatively recent phenomenon in the past decade where states like California, New Mexico, Washington, Nevada have passed these 100% mandates. Yeah.
Taking into consideration how long the development phase takes, is there anything put in place to make sure these policies don't change throughout the project?
Not really. It's a risk, right? There are a lot of developers that have projects under development that were banking on tax credits being available, but the HR 1 that was passed, I don't like calling it the big beautiful bill because I don't think it's that beautiful, that was passed in July, that changes the economics for the developers that can't either start construction or safe harbor to take advantage of those tax credits. So changing policies is definitely a risk.
For renewable portfolio standards, are those capacities in state or just what is purchased to be used in the state?
It varies. It's based on supply typically, and some states cap how much can be imported from out of state, including California. And it also varies for what resources qualify. For example, in California, getting to the 60% renewable energy by 2030 target, hydro can't be used as part of that because of all the environmental impacts of hydro. However, going to 100% clean energy by 2045, California allows hydro to be counted, as well as nuclear and net zero natural gas paired with carbon capture. But, end of the day, there's lots of aggressive renewable energy targets that are helping to drive renewable energy growth in these different states. After you select your site, the next thing that you have to do is tie up the land, right? Get rights to build on the land. And you saw this table here in the environment lecture. It gives you a sense of the land requirements for different electricity generation resources, both upstream for the power plant itself and downstream for things like storage and disposal, waste disposal, fuel disposal. And for wind and solar, as we talked about for wind requires a lot of land, right? But you're only using a small portion of that for the turbines and the ancillary electricity generation equipment itself. So typically what we see for wind projects is they don't own the land outright. Since it can be dual use, it can be used for other things like growing crops and livestock. So what a wind project developer will do is they'll just lease the portion of the land that they need to use for the wind turbines. And that way a farmer or whoever else can continue to own the land and use it for other purposes. For solar, it's a little bit different, right? In most instances for a utility scale project, you can't use that land for anything else. We do see some limited instances of agrivoltaics where you're growing low light crops underneath solar panels, but those are pretty limited. So most of the time, you can't really use the land for something else. So the solar project developer might own the land if it makes sense economically and from a tax standpoint for them, or they could lease it from whoever the owner is if it's a solar project that's on a parcel of a bigger swath of land that's being used for other things. So after tying up the land, you have to worry about permitting. Any business needs to get permits in order to operate, either at the local, state, or federal level, or I should say. Those permits might vary depending on the project type and size and its location. And they could pertain to anything from environmental impact permits to land values to Federal Aviation Administration permits. Pretty much every single wind turbine above a certain height needs to get FAA permits to operate because FAA doesn't want it to interfere with radar or flight patterns. Let's talk about environmental permitting. This is really significant and can be a point at which many projects can fail. A great example of that is the concentrating solar power plant in the Mojave Desert called Ivanpah. It was built in 2014. And during construction in 2010, construction actually had to stop because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the project found a bunch of endangered desert tortoises where they were building this project. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife had to come in and do some studies and make some recommendations on how the project needed to mitigate its impact on these endangered desert tortoises. And ultimately, the project had to spend about $60 million, I think 3% of the total budget for the project, on relocating these desert tortoises. So pretty significant. And at the end of the day, they had to reduce the project size because to mitigate the impact on these desert tortoises. So again, going back to site selection, consideration of things like environmental and wildlife sensitivities are really important when you're selecting your site. Or thinking about different types of technologies. I know over time, we've seen different types of new types of piling technologies. Piling is when you're driving steel structure that holds the panels into the ground. We've seen different types of piling techniques and technologies that reduce the environmental impact on the surrounding land and desert tortoises. Another big consideration for permitting, if you're building on federal lands, it takes a really long time to get permits from out of the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management. Especially now, because I think it was just a few months ago that the Department of Interior announced that they weren't going to be permitting wind and solar projects anymore. And we've already seen the impacts of that with a a pretty large solar project in Esmeralda County in Nevada that got canceled because they couldn't get their permit approved to build the project. And this was after years of development. The governor of Nevada even sent a letter to Department of Interior to ask them to continue to allow permitting of solar projects on lands, because you can imagine in a state like Nevada, we have a lot of solar projects, a really robust solar industry that helps drive economic growth and jobs. So pretty important. Okay, so permitting, it's often when local NIMBY and banana concerns can surface, because oftentimes, particularly in local permitting processes, there's public comment periods where local groups, whether you're a farmer who doesn't want to see farmland converted to solar, or an environmental group that doesn't want to see wind and solar projects impacting local wildlife, they can get involved and say, hey, I don't want this project built. They can lobby their local politicians and community members to try to get them to deny the permit. So it can be a really big hurdle, and is really highlights the importance. This here, you might get pushback also from if you're in a fossil heavy region that has seen a lot of coal-fired power plants retire and getting replaced with renewable energy. You might get pushback from those folks that might be blaming renewable energy for putting their coal-fired power plant out of business. So these dynamics are one of the reasons why it's so important to engage your community if you're a project developer, and engage them early on, and listen to what their needs are, and think about developing partnerships and agreements in the community, so that you're making sure that the projects that you're building are benefiting that community and you have that local support. And along those lines, we've seen relatively recently, the development of things like community benefits agreements and project labor agreements, where projects will enter into formal agreements with their community to promise things like, how much they're going to train the community to help construct the projects, or other ways that they're going to support the community.
When a company finds a new location to start a development, how do they engage the community to establish a relationship with them?
I think it varies. A lot of times, particularly in rural areas, in many states, there are what are called regional development authorities, whose sole job is to kind of work with industry and attract new industry into the area that can help with economic development and job creation. And they have, part of their job is to manage that relationship with the community and with local politicians. So that's what happens in Nevada. We've got regional development authorities that play that role. I don't know if every state has that, though. I know a lot of them do, but it's not like a standard thing. Okay, so as we talked about briefly on Monday, you also have to get permission from the grid operator to interconnect into the grid if you're, wind or solar project, or any power plant. And you do that by applying to what is called the interconnection queue to try to get an interconnection agreement with your grid operator. So the grid operator in your region is either going to be the utility, or it's going to be the ISO or RTO. And that interconnection queue process, it can take at least a year and a half. This is an example kind of queue process and timeline in PJM in the Northeast. And this is meant to be kind of a streamlined process that PJM put in place to try to, there was a lot of too many projects in the queue, in particular renewable energy projects. And there was a lot of congestion in that queue, and it was taking way too long for projects to get through the process. So they created this kind of batching process and timeline for projects here. And that process involves the grid operator conducting studies to understand the feasibility of interconnecting your project into the grid to make sure that it can do so safely. And maybe through this process, they might find that you need to make grid upgrades on the transmission system. And if that's the case, depending on how significant it is, that could be a pretty big hurdle for a project. Again, it gets to the importance of ensuring smart site selection, right? And making sure that you're selecting a site where there's sufficient transmission capacity to plug into the grid. Okay, so we talked about site selection and land rights, permitting, and interconnection. Let's talk about how a project gets paid and finding a customer. So one customer, obviously, in a region could be the utility. And as we talked about in the grid lecture, one way to gauge whether or not a utility has appetite to buy your project is to look at their integrated resource plans, which is their long-term plans, could be 5, 10, 20-year plans that define, what kind of projects they want to build or source. Many of which, like you see here from the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, NIPSCO, a state that doesn't have a renewable portfolio standard. They have significant investments in solar, wind, and batteries. So when NIPSCO came out with this IRP, the investment company that I used to work for, that was run by Jane, Map Energy, we focused development efforts in Indiana, Northern Indiana, to take advantage of this opportunity. So a utility could be your customer, but you could also have kind of a large corporate or industrial customer, or basically non-utility customer, like Stanford, as the buyer of your power. Some of the biggest corporate purchasers of renewable energy include Amazon, Meta, Google, Microsoft, like you can see here. And these procurements are pretty significant relative to how much new capacity, wind and solar capacity, is built in the US every year. It probably makes up more than half of new capacity that's being brought online. So, if you're selling to a utility, that utility might, if you're developing a project, that utility might buy the project from you once it reaches certain development milestones, or the utility can enter into a long-term power purchase agreement with the project, where that project continues to be owned by an independent power producer. So we talked about long-term PPAs and the fact that they're both physical and virtual PPAs, and the corporate buyer too might enter into a PPA. We've seen instances where, like with Apple, where they actually purchase and operate the project themselves. But most of the time with corporate procurements, it's through long-term power purchase agreements where the project is owned by somebody else. If you don't have a PPA in place, you could, or a particular customer that you're selling to, you could just sell into the wholesale power markets if you're located in an ISO or RTO region, which creates a little bit more uncertainty, right, around the power, the price that you're going to receive for your power, because you don't have a price locked in as you would through a power purchase agreement. But it could also create some upside too, right? If you're able, especially if you have some battery energy storage built along with your wind and solar project, it allows you to dispatch and take advantage of price arbitrage opportunities as prices vary over time in these wholesale power markets. We don't see this, I think, too often, especially because, let's say you're located in West Texas and you built a wind project 10 years ago. If you were a merchant, operated as a merchant power plant, without a PPA, solely selling into these wholesale power markets, you'd be taking negative pricing right now. Another way that projects get paid are through what are called renewable energy certificates or renewable energy credits, or RECs. And taking a step back, the electricity that is generated by a renewable energy projects has two components. One is just the generic electricity that's being generated, right? Electricity is electricity. And the other is the renewable energy attributes of that electricity. And these two components are valued and can be sold separately. So if I'm a wind project, I can sell my electricity into the wholesale power market and get a price per megawatt hour for that electricity. And I can separately have a contract for someone to buy the renewable energy attributes of that electricity. The bulk of demand for RECs for REC purchases is driven by the renewable portfolio standards that I talked about on Monday, where, if I'm a utility or an independent power producer and I have to comply with pretty aggressive renewable electricity procurement targets imposed by my state, I could either, say retire a natural gas power plant and replace it with wind and solar, or I could keep my natural gas power plant online and I can buy renewable energy certificates from another project that's built by somebody else in order to comply with that RPS. A portion of the REC market, though, is also driven by voluntary procurements. Like if you're Apple or Microsoft and you have a 100% renewable energy procurement target, that's independent of any state mandates, then you might, and maybe you're in an area where you can't procure. You're in not in an ISO or RTO, so you can't really procure renewable energy directly through a PPA. Then you can alternatively buy RECs in order to meet your 100% renewable energy target.
Is there an agency that certifies the renewable energy certificates to make sure there are no copies being handed out by other companies?
W. Regis is the one in the West, where if you want to be able to qualify for formal RPS compliance, you have to register with this entity. I think it's either nonprofit or governmental. I can't recall exactly which one, but and then there are, in addition, on top of that, there are nonprofits that also have certified RECs, like Greenie certification, that creates another level of certainty around the additionality of the RECs. And I forget the names of the kind of W. Regis equivalents across the nation, but they do operate regionally. So that's kind of getting paid. And let's talk about financing. Financing is pretty cookie cutter for utility scale solar and wind projects these days. You need a combination of debt, sponsor equity, and also tax equity if you're going to take advantage of tax credit. So let's talk. I'm going to mostly talk about tax credits with regards to financing, because this is the thing that's increasingly not cookie cutter and is HR 1 passed earlier this year kind of put a wrench in it as well. So tax credits, there are renewable clean electricity tax credits in the form of a production tax credit or an investment tax credit available for wind and solar projects, but also for biomass projects, geothermal projects, battery energy storage as well. And these tax credits have a pretty significant impact on the economics of renewable energy projects. You can see most of the time when we show you the LCOE charts, we show you unsubsidized, but the LCOE report also shows the impact of those tax credits on the LCOE. And the result of the tax credits is that they drive additional deployment, right? We need to accelerate deployment of wind and solar in order to continue to live safely on this planet. So the objective of keeping the tax credits in place, even though LCOEs are really competitive, is to help increase deployment of these renewable energy resources. Renewable energy projects in the US have benefited from some form of tax credit, an investment tax credit or a production tax credit, for years. In the case of wind, since 1992, and in the case of solar, since 2005. Just in the same way that the oil and gas industry has benefited from tax code related deductions and tax credits for decades. And these tax credits have been really intermittent. I think the production tax credit, which was originally designed for wind, has expired or lapsed probably something like 8 or 9 times since 1992, which creates a lot of whiplash for the industry, right? And one of the reasons why, when you look at annual installations of wind and solar, you see a little bit of jerkiness. So we thought that the production tax credit and the investment tax credit were going to expire in 2022, but the Inflation Reduction Act extended those tax credits and also increased them and made them available to more renewable energy resources. Tax credits were slated to make up about 75% of the Inflation Reduction Act funds that were going to flow towards clean energy. So of the hundreds of billions of dollars anticipated to flow to clean energy from the Inflation Reduction Act, 75% from tax credits. So pretty significant. Wind and solar tax credits, the geothermal, et cetera, were a big portion of that, but we also had residential tax credits for energy efficiency. We had tax credits for domestic battery manufacturing. While wind and solar tax credits were a big part, they're not the only part. So HR 1, the budget reconciliation bill, passed July 4th of this year. Again, changed those tax credits, and it ended up phasing out and or accelerating the retirement of many of them, including most of the tax credits that are available to households. So you can see here the new deadlines that have been put in place because of HR 1, many of which are ending by the end of this year. So if you or anyone you know is interested in getting a heat pump or a rooftop solar project, you definitely want to do it by the end of the year. The electric vehicle tax credits expired actually September 30th, and the EV charger tax credit that's available both to residents and to commercial customers that live in low-income census tracts, that's going to expire June 30th, 2026. And sorry, one thing that I'll say about tax credits for households in particular, a barrier to taking advantage of tax credits is going to be whether or not you have taxable income to offset with these tax credits, right? Because the way that it works is you build the project, and then after you build the project, you file on your annual tax filing a particular form, and you get a reduction in your taxes due by the amount of the tax credit. So if you don't have taxable income, say you're a low-income household, then these tax credits are hard to take advantage of. One way to overcome that could be through a leasing structure, though. Say where a third-party commercial entity owns the project, monetizes the tax credit for the household, and leases the project to the household. All right, so that was household tax credits. These are the commercial tax credits. You've got the energy efficiency ones, the 48E and 45. This is the investment tax credit and the production tax credit that are available for clean electricity power plants like solar, wind, battery storage. They could also be for rooftops. Say if there's a commercial customer that has rooftop solar, they can get anywhere between 30% to 70% of the cost of that project covered through a tax credit. Again, they need tax liability to take advantage of it, which means that if you don't have tax liability, you really have three options. The first is you bring in a tax equity investor, typically a large bank that has taxable income, but they're not going to want to do any projects below like $50 million, or $100 million. So that makes it particularly challenging for some of the smaller projects that don't have a tax liability. The IRA made it possible for projects to, rather than do all the complex accounting and financial structuring of bringing in a tax equity investor, they enabled tax credits to just be sold directly through a mechanism called transferability. So that transferability mechanism, and there's actually a Stanford alum who started a company, Alfred, that is a marketplace for these tax credits. He used to work at Treasury, so he saw the opportunity there and developed this company, Crux. So you can sell your tax credits directly via transferability. And the other thing that the IRA did is if you're a non-taxable entity like a local government or a nonprofit, rural co-op, or a tribe, it instituted a mechanism called direct pay, where that nonprofit can file with the IRS and get a cash payment in the amount of the tax credit. So IRA did a lot of great things with the tax credits. And in addition, HR 1 changed those tax credits and accelerated when they're going to retire. The 4080 and 45 tax credits for wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, battery projects were changed. Basically, at the end of this year, some restrictive foreign entity of concern requirements come into place that are pretty prohibitive. And the IRS hasn't even come out with their guidance yet on the FEOC requirements, and they're probably not going to anytime soon because of the shutdown. So you can imagine there's a lot of like uncertainty if you're building a wind and solar project right now. And as you can see here, the wind and solar ITC and PTC in particular were targeted. It basically phases out, it was originally meant to phase out in 2035. But now you have to start construction by June 30th, 2026 in order to qualify. And after that, it retires. You do have 4 years if you do prove a start of construction to place it in service. So that's why we'll continue to see projects take advantage of these tax credits for some time. And if you're under 1.5 megawatts, there's special requirements associated with it where you can, you don't necessarily need to physically start construction. All you have to do is purchase at least 5% of the value of your project. Say, you purchase 5% of the equipment, the panels, and then you'll have 4 years after that to place it in service and still qualify for the tax credit. That's one of the strategies that we're actually pursuing right now with our partner Capital Good Fund, that's a solar lease provider, is making an equipment purchase by the end of the year to safe harbor a bunch of residential and other commercial rooftop solar projects so that they are not subject to the FEOC requirements, and we've got 4 years to place them in service. Although I imagine we're going to be placing them in service much sooner than that because of the significant demand that we're seeing. These tax credits will come up a lot throughout the year. Maybe one thing that I didn't mention, an investment tax credit, it's structured as covering a portion of your project cost, right? So like 30% of your project cost can be offset with the tax credit. For a production tax credit, it's in $1 per megawatt hour structure. So if you're a wind project, you might get $23 a megawatt hour from the production tax credit. And historically, the production tax credit was available to wind, the investment tax credit to solar, but the IRA changed that and just made them, both available to any resource the project could pick. You can imagine that an ITC is better for high CapEx projects, right? Projects that cost more to build, and the PTC is better for general rule of thumb, there are always exceptions, but the PTC is better for projects that have higher productivity. Okay, so that's the renewable energy project development life cycle. Thank you.